Right, let's have a little look at what our topic is this evening. We're going to be looking at liturgy and the celestial bodies. I've called it that because it's quicker than saying the moon, the planets, the stars, and the sun. Oh, I'm missing the text. 1 second. Let's just get it from over here. There we go. Now, we've already looked a little bit at the concept of the Church's year that you can see here on the screen, passing from Advent to Christmas and through Epiphany and Lent and Easter, Pentecost, then back to ordinary time until Advent cycles around again. And what we're going to look at tonight is how this calendar evolved, how come it came about, and what that evolution very specifically had to do with the movement of the sun and the moon and the planets and the stars. And we're going to do that in 3 stages. We're going to have a brief review of astronomy and astrology and see how time is measured, because that's very important for liturgy. Even though liturgy exists outside time, we are nevertheless in an incarnated state, and we're going to see how time and the liturgy mesh together around the most supreme way of measuring time, that is the celestial bodies. Then we're going to explore the relationship between the movement of these celestial bodies, particularly the sun and the moon, and see how this influenced the celebration of Christian festivals. We'll also look very briefly at astrology and the history of its acceptance or not, and why, by Christians. And since it's Christmas and Jupiter and Saturn are soon to be in conjunction on the 21st, we're going to explore with Joris the most famous star story in the Bible, and that's the story of the Magi and the star that led to Bethlehem. Now, ever since human beings have looked up to the sun, the moon, and the stars, they've marveled at this phenomenon. And judging by the alignment of some of the ancient stone monuments that we know, such as the stone circles and lines of Northern Europe and the alignment of the pyramids, people soon began to use their observations of the positions of the sun and the stars and the phases of the moon for religious and also calendrical purposes. That is to say, when you were supposed to come together to do this, when the lambs were supposed to be led into the field with the rams, when you were supposed to sow your seed. So here you can see on the screen Stonehenge in a low light, and here the famous stones of Karnak in Brittany. These are very close to the sea, aren't they?
Yeah,
Joris?
Actually some of them, so the alignments were created at the moment when the sea was way lower. So some of them now are underwater.
Oh, how interesting. Yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah, I'd love to visit. I've always wanted to ever since I was a child. The Egyptians and the Babylonians could actually predict eclipses. They were quite sophisticated in their observations of the sun and the moon and the stars. The Babylonians, here, there's some controversy about whether the pyramids are aligned in the line of Orion's belt in the sky. That is, the 3 great pyramids of Giza are in a certain angle. And people have wondered, since one of the great shafts of the pyramids points up to the heliacal rising of Sothis, the dog star, whether or not the alignment of the pyramids is in the shape of Orion's belt. In some of the Hamitic tribes further to the south in the desert, archaeological Paleolithic excavations have revealed similar configurations in the tribes in the south. The Babylonians were the first to divide the sky into 360 degrees, easily divided into 12 by 30 degrees each. And they assigned constellations to the 12 segments of those degrees. On the left, you can see a cuneiform text which gives a Babylonian account of the appearance of Halley's comet in 164 BC. So they were clearly very vigilant around the stars, and they looked to them not just for calendrical purposes, but also to weave their calendar into their daily lives, the cycle of life. And they also gave names to the planets, and they ascribed qualities to the planets too, like heat and dryness and wetness and cold. They named Astarte, Ishtar, Venus, who could appear either as a morning star when she was the goddess of war, or the evening star when she was the goddess of love. So you see, they put quite a lot of emotional, psychological thought into the way in which they observed the movements of the planets and the stars. Now, before we go into how all of this was inherited by the Christian calendar, we're going to do two very brief things. Firstly, let's remember that the Christians have inherited their calendar from the Hebrews too. So the weekly calendar of a weekly festival, we're not going to look at that tonight, but some great moments in the Christian calendar, like Passover, that turned into Pâques, Easter time, these have been inherited from the Hebrew calendar too. But we're not going to look at that in any detail because we haven't got time tonight. What we're going to try and do is to look at the way these celestial bodies have impacted the Christian calendar. So let's remind ourselves of a few simple astronomical facts before we get going. First of all, let's just remember that before the Copernican revolution, it was generally believed that the sun and the planets revolved around the Earth. There's a slight adjustment to this, which I'll describe in one moment. But on the left, you can see this wonderful copy of a classical text made in the 500s and in Leiden University. And it shows actually very specifically the position of the planets that could only have happened in about 618 AD. It's believed that it was copied from life, but they made a diagram of the planets for the Carolingian court, I believe, that reflected the sky under the time of the son of Charlemagne, I think it must have been. And on the right you can see Orion there, illustrated in this book. Now, the sun's movement through the seasons is completely predictable. It's consistent. The Earth takes a specific number of days to circle the sun, that is 365 and a quarter, roughly, which is why we have to have a leap year every 4 years. But because the axis of the Earth is slightly tilted, as you can see from this picture, the seasons are reversed in the two hemispheres. So the Earth is tilted away from the sun in the winter in the north, and it's tilted towards the sun in summer in the north. And that means that on certain days, that is the spring and the autumn equinoxes, the length of daylight and the length of night is exactly equal. This is due to the tilt of the Earth in its orbit around the sun. You can imagine here, the tilt remains consistent. It's pointing in here, and as it tilts, it points out as it goes around the sun. There's a little summer solstice and winter solstice picture so that you can see exactly the Arctic Circle is pointed away from the sun in the winter, and the Arctic Circle is pointed towards the sun in the summer. This is not going to affect the movement of the fixed stars because the Earth is moving in relation to the sun, but not moving in the same cosmic dimension in relation to the fixed stars, which we'll describe in a minute. So when the sun is at its lowest in the sky and the days are at the shortest, it's going to be the winter solstice, the December solstice. And when the sun is highest in the sky and the days are the longest and hottest, we're at the summer solstice, at least in the northern hemisphere. Now, the phases of the moon don't coincide neatly with the movement of the Earth around the sun. So the moon can be full or it can be new at any time in the calendar at all, regardless of these solstices. It's almost random, you might say, if it wasn't so mathematical, if that makes any sense. The ancients had a very hard time trying to figure out how the phases of the moon correlated with the movement of the sun in the sky, especially when they were trying to produce a calendar for religious purposes, when the moon was considered an important religious influence on the earth, especially in pagan religions, and also in Christianity, as we'll see in a few minutes. Now, from the viewpoint of the earth, for instance, here we are. Where are we? We're way out here. Well, we're way inside here. We've begun with Jupiter here. From the viewpoint of the Earth, the orbit of the planets around the Sun is erratic, but it's predictable, more or less. And that's what gave planets their name, in Greek, the wanderers. They seem to wander across the sky, unlike the fixed stars. And as opposed to the fixed stars, these planets seem to the ancient to wander around the constellations in these arced sweeps. Sometimes they're in one constellation, sometimes they were in another constellation. Sometimes it seemed as if they were going backwards or retrograde in comparison to where they were. The fixed stars are the stars that, here's the phases of the moon, as you can see, from full to invisible. Over here, a new moon. The fixed stars don't wander around the sun. Here's the planet Earth going around the sun, and here are the fixed stars, what we know as the constellations. Those stars for us seem to circle the North Star, because the North Star is the star that appears to us to be directly over the North Pole. Wherever we are around in the Northern Hemisphere, wherever we are in circuit of the Earth, the North Star seems to be directly overhead. And these constellations seem to revolve around it, even though we are the ones that are doing the revolving, if that makes any sense. That's how it looks to us. I'm sure you've seen photographs that have been taken where you can see the lines of the fixed stars in comparison to the movement of the planets, or say a comet that streaks across. Now, the movement of the fixed stars is totally and utterly predictable. They're the stars that make up our constellations, after all. They haven't changed in human history, at least, including the signs of the zodiac that appear over the horizon at predictable and very regular times of year. So now we understand a little bit about the mechanism of the celestial bodies, we can make a few observations. Last week we were discussing flora and fauna and their use in liturgy. And I mentioned that medieval Christians in particular looked to nature as a sort of second Bible. Everything that God created spoke of an aspect of God's love, God's mercy, God's justice, God's truth. Flowers and fruit carried lessons with them. And we discovered here are two more pictures of the Virgin. If you remember, she's always surrounded by roses and strawberries. And these strawberries, if you remember from last week, are there because the strawberry bears a red fruit and a white flower at the same time, symbolizing both Mary's virginity and the blood of Christ, the fruit of her womb. Now, given that the whole of nature, all of nature, has something to say, some message of God to proclaim, what role did the celestial bodies play in this system? And you can bet it's going to be an important one. First of all, we've got to understand that Christians believe that we are actually living in a part of nature, a part of creation, that knows decay and corruption due to our fallen nature. You remember that hymn, "Abide with me, change and decay in all around I see, but thou who changest not, abide with me." An evocation of this idea that beyond the realm of transience and decay where we are here in the Ptolemaic system exists a perfection that we can only see at a distance, or God has left traces of that perfection in the movement of the celestial bodies. To grossly simplify for a minute, broadly speaking, the further away from Earth you travelled, the less the miasma of this fallen state was going to affect your path across the sky. In Ptolemy's Almagest, the celestial spheres actually have lives of their own. We've got to think of these not as we think of them now as planets going around the sun, contained little bodies moving through a vacuum, through dark, bleak nothingness. That's not the way earlier peoples saw it. They saw these celestial spheres almost like crystal balls around the sun. And each of the spheres, they were spheres, not orbits, they were spheres all around, like layers of an onion. And each of these spheres had a luminous body within it that was one of the planets. Each of the spheres, the order of the spheres went something like this. The Earth, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, then the fixed stars, and the primum mobile, or the first moved. This great sphere over here that is the origin of movement but does not move itself. The realm beyond all of the stars, the realm of heaven. Uranus is not visible, and Neptune is not visible to the human eye, so they're not included in this system. They were only discovered much, much later after the invention of the telescope. Now, the moon, being closest to the Earth, is the celestial body that changes the most. It goes through phases, and they don't correlate terribly well with the movement of the fixed stars or of the sun either. Mercury, for instance, why is that put closest? Well, it seems to move at great speed in the heavens and frequently be in retrograde. It seems to go backwards very often. It's spinning around the sun at a great speed, so from where we are, it sometimes looks as if it's going backwards. Have you heard that expression, Mercury's in retrograde, so Zoom doesn't work, for instance? Precisely because Mercury is the messenger of the gods. It moves really quickly, and it can appear as a morning star or an evening star, but you have to get up really early to be able to see it, or stay just at the moment of sunset to be able to glimpse it speeding down below the horizon.
Quicksilver.
Quicksilver, yes. Yes, isn't that funny? And each of the planets also has a metal associated with them, like Venus is associated with copper, for instance. Venus can also be a morning and an evening star. Now, the funny thing about Venus, though, is that it was soon observed, even by the earliest peoples, that Venus sometimes appeared as a crescent, just like the moon. Venus, as it moves around the sun, sometimes has part of its globe obscured on a dark side, from our point of view. Well, from Venus's point of view as well, I suppose. So Venus seems to have phases, and the early people observed this. And then a little bit later on, just before the Copernican system came out, they said, well, that must mean that Venus orbits the sun. So they made these little adjustments to the Ptolemaic system to see if they could make more sense of it, given humans' observations of what was going on. So that's why Venus has been put in this place. The sun's movement is predictable, it's regular through the seasons. It may sometimes be eclipsed by the moon. The ancients, incidentally, knew that the moon was a lot smaller than the sun. They also were able to estimate the circumference of the earth in Alexandria in the Ptolemaic period. Mars and Jupiter and Saturn seem to move far more slowly through the sky than some of these other bodies, mostly because they have a slower orbit or because they're vastly further away from us. The realm of perfection, though, can only be found in the fixed stars. And beyond the fixed stars in the primum mobile. Here you can see Dante and this vision of heaven and these great spheres, both of hell underneath and purgatory, and then here heaven coming up, touching the fixed stars and the primum mobile. Those orbits never change, not with the seasons, not with the years, and each of these seasons now, each of these spheres that are around the earth has a luminous body set within it, and that luminous body is personified in the notion of angels. So can you see how this is beginning to have relevance to the way that the Christian calendar is formed and what is celebrated at certain times? And if you have an interest in saying that when you're in a liturgical service, what you're doing is attempting to use temporal time to touch eternal time, to disappear into the fixed stars and the primum mobile. And to get there, you need a congregation of angels to help you through each of these movements of the spheres at the accompaniment of the angels, who are also singing God's praises in the music of the spheres. Here we have the music of the spheres. On the left-hand side here, you can see that each of the planets has been associated with one of the muses, the seven goddesses of the arts and sciences in ancient Greek mythology, and how Christians took this on and mobilized it for the use of Christian purposes too, celebrating the archangels and angels and identifying them with the music of the spheres and with these luminous bodies within these spheres that God had placed there and created purposefully to leave a fingerprint of his creation of the earth. On the right-hand side, you can see somebody has had a go at telling us what these harmonizations look like for Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Earth, Venus, Mercury, and what here is the place. What does it say, Joyce? Can you read it? Hic locum haber
Etiam Luna? No?
Etiam Luna. Yes, that's it. Here we have the place of the moon. Mercury is very fast, and there's a lot of notes to it, as you can see. Let's think for a moment. Besides movement, you can see here in the angels are turning the wheel of the primum mobile, from the primum mobile to the fixed stars. I love that picture. Besides movement, each of these spheres is going to transmit to the Earth what are called influences. That's the subject matter of astrology. Each of the planets exerts an influence not just on human beings, but on all life, including inert life on Earth. Now, Orthodox theologians, right up to relatively modern times, accepted the theory that planets had an effect on events and on psychology, even on plants and on minerals. God had put them there for a reason, and this was the reason. What they couldn't accept, just to digress for a moment, were three things. Here's some medieval astrologers looking up into the sky with two recorders here. They all seem to be monks, as you can see. So astrology was not something that was practiced by wizards and witches and what have you. It was right at the heart of the Christian establishment. All the great kings and queens had their astrology written out for them by the experts in the field. When they were born, they would consult them before going to war or making a major decision. Sometimes they would consult them even before cutting fingernails or their hair or something. They certainly used it in medicine. So here you can see each of the constellations. Here's Sagittarius. Here is, what else have we got? We've got Aquarius down here and the Ram, Aries. Each of these constellations was associated with a part of the body, and you couldn't be a practicing medical person without a thorough knowledge of astrology. This is what they didn't like, the church didn't like. They didn't like this sort of lucrative and politically undesirable practice of astrological predictions. So people would go like to one of those fortune tellers on the upstairs in Lexington Avenue that lures you in with the promise of a fortune and then tells you that you're possessed by evil spirits and somebody's put a curse on you and it's going to cost $1,500 to remove it and only they can do it. This is what the church objected to back in that time. Not the science of it, nor the influence of the celestial bodies on people, but the fact, like all things, it could be abused. And this was the way they felt that it was abused. Secondly, they were against something that they called astrological determinism. That is to say, what they said was these celestial bodies can, but they needn't affect our reason and our will. So it's not denying their force. All they're doing is giving you a potential or a propensity to act in a certain way. The stars determine that the stars can affect you in that, but they're not going to say that's your only fate. That's what's going to happen to you if you've been born under this star. A wise person knows how to resist influences, whether they come from wicked people or from stars that are exerting an evil influence. But unfortunately, most people are not wise. Therefore, the planets affect dumb people more than they affect wise people. Wherever that wisdom comes from, it may be a simple Christian wisdom, and not a sort of sophisticated wisdom that says, well, I know what my planets say and I'm going to resist it. It can be quite instinctive, like the wife of Bath. And who was it? The fault, dear Caesar, lies not in our stars that we are thus or thus. So those were the reasons that the early church didn't like it. Finally, they were against any practices that would seem to imply worship of these celestial beings that were luminous bodies in the spheres. They were even against anything that would encourage the worship of planets, but they were very subtle about this. It was permitted to bury a little metal plate in your field to ensure your crops thrived or that your cattle weren't stricken with blight or whatever it's called. So you'd put a little metal plate in your field with a hieroglyph of a planet on it, but when you buried it, you were not allowed to accompany the burial of that little thing with an incantation of any sort. Isn't that interesting? There was a wordless liturgy that was to do with planets and stars that the church approved of. And they're still dug up in fields today all over Europe. There's a little example of what they might look like. Now these spheres, these luminous bodies within the spheres, were moved by love for God. That's what moved them. It wasn't gravity or the sun or some sort of abstract principle. The movement of the celestial bodies was a movement of love. And love, wherever love is found, tries to participate in its object. I'm coming to that slide in 1 second. Let's go back here just for 1 second. Love wants to participate in the person or the thing that is loved. It wants to become as like to what it loves as possible. That's why we say somebody is lovely. That's where that expression comes from. But because we're a finite creation, we can't share in this motionless perfection of God. The planets can't either. So the nearest approach that these celestial bodies, these angels in the stars, can make to that perfect motion is the quickest and the most regular possible movement that there is. And that was conceived as circular, the perfect sphere. They're trying to imitate the perfect immobility of God, this perfect suspension in love. But they can't because they're part of the created order. And all created order is fallen to one extent or another. And the nearest the planets can get to that sort of perfection is to move in these great circles, in these spheres. That's why we still speak about the liturgical cycle of the year. We still, when you look it up, they're going to try and make it look like a sphere. And I like to think that that's because it's an endless round, whether that might be regular, complicated, like this one, or very simple. You can find lots of examples of this, of these images of the Christian year being conceived of as this cycle, this great sphere. So the worship of the church is striving to achieve that perfect motion that's reflected in the celestial spheres, even though we're on a fickle and a changing planet. And we worship in the presence of these angels who are sometimes conceived as these conscious intellectual beings that inhabits each of these spheres and that's moved by a sort of intellectual love of God. Now, let's see what this has got to do with the Christian calendar and how it impacts it very directly. I talked for a moment about equinoxes and solstices. And here's what the movement of the sun has to do with the liturgical cycle, at least as how it was developed in the northern hemisphere. The winter solstice, December the 21st or thereabouts, the sun is at its lowest in the sky. And it's just about to reverse its course. It's about to start to go back up again. And that's when light is born into the world at Christmas time. So there you can see there's a direct corollary between the Christian calendar and the observation of the movement of the sun. I'm going to have to explain something here very quickly. Not only do you have these 4 great points, that is, the winter solstice, the spring equinox, the summer solstice, and the autumn equinox. These mark the times when the sun is lowest in the sky, when night and day are completely equal, that's an equinox, when the sun is highest in the sky, and once again when night and day are equal, which happens twice a year. Between an equinox and a solstice, there's something called a cross-quarter day. These cross-quarter days were particularly important in Celtic Christianity. And if you want to know a little bit more about them, we have that course on Celtic Christianity that's in the spirituality course, how they were celebrated and used in the Celtic tradition. I'm just going to talk briefly about each of those cross-quarter days and solstices and equinoxes. Candlemas is a cross-quarter day. It's halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox on February the 2nd. The sun now is definitely on its way back. There's no doubt about it. It's the presentation of Christ, the light of the world, in the temple, 40 days after his birth, Candlemas. It's the time when candles are blessed and the light of Epiphany finally is shining all around us. And now you can take out your evergreens and burn them in the fields in another great festival of light on this quarter day. It's also Groundhog Day, which is the way it sort of emerged into the secular calendar. The secular calendar observes quarter days and cross-quarter days quite religiously. And you can find out how by looking up on the internet. And you can see, Mothering Sunday, used to be Lady Day, and all of that business. Now, how is Easter determined? Here's a very good-willed person trying to describe it. I don't know how many times I've tried to describe this, and I leave myself more confused than every time I try and do it. Now, the spring equinox, that is when night and day are equal in the springtime. The days are about to get lighter and lighter until the sun reaches its zenith, its apogee in the sky. It's when the great festival of the resurrection is held. It's when nature is reborn in the northern hemisphere. I said earlier on that the moon has an effect on the Christian calendar too. And here he's describing to us that Easter Day is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. So if the Easter cannot be earlier than the 21st of March, which is the vernal equinox. If it so happens that the moon has been full just a couple of days after the vernal equinox, you can have an early Easter. If it's got to wait for a long time before it can get full again, you're going to have a late Easter. Once again, if you want to know a little bit more about that and why the Celtic Church maintained that lunar tradition longer than the Roman Church did, you can have a little look at that Celtic spirituality video and it'll tell you all about that. Our next great cross-quarter day, that is to say halfway between the spring equinox and the summer solstice, is May Day, the month of May. It's the month of May, the 1st of May is this cross-quarter day, celebrates the one who brought light into the world. So the light is still increasing at this time. We've not yet got to the summer solstice. And the month of Mary is placed there for that specific reason. It's celebrating the bringing of the light into the world, and it's often celebrated with crowning Mary with flowers and processions in the streets and pilgrimages to Marian shrines, for instance, in the medieval church in particular. The next great moment is the summer solstice. That is the 21st of June or thereabouts. This is when the sun is at its very highest and it's just about to reverse its course. It's when you're allowed to say the nights are drawing in. A very depressing thing to say in the month of June, I have to say. It's the feast day of John the Baptist. The church has chosen this part of the summer solstice to be this feast day of the one who proclaimed light in the darkness. So on the left-hand side there you can see, did you want to mention that, Joris?
Yeah, it's a Feu de la Saint-Jean. It's quite common. I don't know if it exists in England too. Like people gather on the it's 21st or 24th?
24th. Or
24th, yes.
Yeah.
24th of June for usually just to around the fire like this.
Like a bonfire and celebrating the height of the sun in the sky. On the right-hand side there you can see it being celebrated in Florence with a bonfire there. Here's another cross-quarter day. This is the day that's halfway between the summer solstice, that is the feast of John the Baptist, and the autumn equinox. This cross-quarter day is Happy Lammas Day. This is from the Unitarians. I thought you would like this, Joris. After your paper on blessed bread, there's a very Unitarian thing to say at the end there. Traditionally, the first harvest festival of the year when people would bring a loaf of church to be blessed and made magic. Not sure that was the point of it. But generally speaking, on this day, the 1st of August, people would process through the streets. They would bring loaves of bread to the church to be especially blessed, and the loaves would have been made out of the first harvest of wheat. Sometimes it was associated with little dolls or images made out of the last sheaf of wheat that had been cut in the field and would be hung up in the houses. Loaf Mass Day, Lammas Day. Here's one from the Church of Shakespeare in Stratford-on-Avon, an evening of music, prose and poetry featuring merry noise, which I presume is some sort of music. They tried to give it a bit of a medieval feel. Tickets £12 to include a glass of Guild Chapel Lammas Ale. I'm not sure I could vouch for that, but there we go. After a couple of them, I don't suppose it matters. So this is another way in which the church is using the cycle of the sun in order to be able to commemorate a very Christian thing, which is Holy Communion. The autumn equinox, September the 21st, St. Michael and all angels, Michaelmas, a time when they celebrate, when the church celebrates the ministry of angels, at a time when night and day are at equal spacing. And our final day, before we get to, my computer seems to have been playing up, a cross-quarter day, that is the day that is halfway between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice. The light is beginning to fade. It's the time when we celebrate all human beings born in the fragility of our changing earth, who have managed to touch the immovable stars, who have become like to the perfection of God. And when we celebrate Halloween, as the light is beginning to fade. So you can see there how the movement of the sun through the church's year, this great celestial body, has affected the Christian calendar. Perhaps the pagans celebrated it and Christians found other ways to insert it, and that was the way that they did it. That's all I have for you, but we have a treat in store from Joris, who's going to talk about the Magi and the star. Did you want to swap seats? Mm-hmm. Is that big enough? Can you see it?
Yeah, we'll manage. Well, thank you, Nigel. It was really interesting. And it makes a lot of sense also for the story of the Magi. That's happening at the winter equinox, if I remember well. Yes. And it's interesting because it's also... So the summer equinox is St. John the Baptist.
The summer solstice.
Yeah. Is St. John the Baptist. And you have the birthday of Christ, which is how many months before?
8 months.
Yeah, something like that.
8 months.
So it's interesting. Before. You have this fires and the light. And I'm going to talk about the Magi and the star, like the story we hear so much about these days, and until Epiphany, it's going to be our readings. Astrology, as Nigel has showed us, was omnipresent in the ancient world, and I'm mostly going to talk about the ancient world and how Christians. Do you have my slides too?
Yes, they're on the same.
How Christians related to astrology, because it was not obvious, as you could see. It's a different worldview that's acting. And different conception of freedom and how you are going to behave and who is going to influence you. And so some scholars even said that the role astrology had in the ancient world, in the Greco-Roman world, was the most important and widespread piety that people had. So like it was really something that was built in their worldview and the things they would do, not only because astrology was also linked with traveling, but also because it was linked to like food, cropping, all of this. So many aspects of people's life, and I think we don't see it today because of how we live, but we're tied to the lights in the sky, to using them and being with them, not only for practical reasons, but also for religious reasons, as Nigel said. And when, for instance, he was talking about the different phases of Venice. Like Venice was not, as we understand it, as just something material, but it was also representing some theological and spiritual ideas about like Venus being veiled, just like she's also the goddess of eroticism. So you have all of these spiritual meanings of the stars and the planets, in the ways they evolve in the sky, in the way they interact with each others and with us. And so that's something which is always in the back when we are talking about the stars also in the Christian tradition, because people at that time related spiritually to things that we maybe today don't even see because we live in the city and we cannot see the sky anymore, and we don't need it to live. But people needed it to live and be themselves. So, So that's my first slide. So the followers of Christ, they had to find a way to relate this very omnipresent astrological culture, basically, with the different tendencies, and they did it in different tendencies in different ways, because not all of them agreed, of course, on how you should relate to the planets. And the major problem for them, as Nigel already mentioned, is that for the ancient, the celestial bodies had a deterministic, a fatalistic impact on your lives. And you can see how it's clashing with the idea of a God that's merciful, who is intervening to save the people, to save the disciples of Christ. So it's entering into a form of a clash that early Christian authors tried to resolve as best as they could in different ways. Yes, so they tried to organize it differently, and they couldn't figure out that the stars were playing solo, basically. It had to be part of the Christian cosmogony and the way God created them in the Hebrew Bible as part of the creation, not as gods themselves or representation of gods like it was in the ancient time. So this picture is really interesting because it shows all the tensions that I'm talking about. So it's a frieze from I think it was a sarcophagus, and you can see the different symbols of the zodiac. Mm-hmm. So here you can see Gemini, like they're together, twins. The Cancer. Yeah. So different signs of the zodiac. And here you can see a cross, a Christian cross. And so that's a piece of wood cutting, of stone carving that was transformed into a Christian art too. And so you see the the rivalry between these symbols and how it's playing together and almost against each other. Nigel mentioned it, but one of the moment that's key to understand Christmas, and you've probably heard about that before, is there were a lot of different cults in the moment where the Christians spread and the followers of Christ really started to develop and spread. And one of them was Sol Invictus, so it's basically linked to the sun, and it's a festival that was linked to the sun. And you can see that on this early mosaic of Christ is depicted as a sun, and the figures in the shape of Sol Invictus, who was this god, this Helios Christ. This mosaic comes from the necropole of St. Peter's Basilica, so it's under St. Peter's Basilica, and you can see how he has these rays that figure him as a star too. Up, next slide. Yes, so for as I mentioned, you can see from this picture and also from the next one that there is no monolithic repudiation of astrology and the relationship to stars when it comes to talking about Christian revelation. Okay. I'm going to focus mostly now on one story that we've all heard before in one way or another. It's from the Gospel of Matthew, and it's chapter 2, verse 1 to 12, which bears witness to this early Christian wrestling with the reality and powers of the stars in the ancient world. So in this famous story of the Magi who came from the east to pay homage to Christ, you can see, I may actually read it. Let's read it together. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star and at its rising, and we have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet." And the prophecy. Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there, ahead of them, went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. So you see the star is omnipresent here, and it's actually the star that's leading to Christ, leading them to Christ. So we're going to wonder a little bit, who are these Magi? Who are they? So they seem to be astrologists, and actually the word Magi has appeared in other sources from the time, and they usually refer to people who were people from the priestly castes of nowadays Iran, so Persia. And so they were basically professionals in divination, professionals in astrology, in reading the sky, or in analyzing dreams and telling what the dreams are saying. And at the end, they actually receive a dream that they interpret. And so there are really like specialists, they're almost scientists in this domain. And so what we're going to try to see is how this scientific, this technical knowledge they had is playing out against the Christian revelation. So what does this story tell us about the stars? That's my second slide, sorry. What does this story tell us about the stars? What is that star that appeared to the Magi? So three of the questions that were key for early Christian thinkers was, had some Magi actually managed to locate Jesus by means of astrology? So that is, like, could you actually get to Christ because of the knowledge you've acquired from the stars? Does it mean that astrology is valid? What does it mean that the Savior was born under a star? So these three questions are going to be really important for all Christian authors. So I'm not a specialist of astrology, and Nigel seems to be way more versed in astrology than I am, but apparently there is no good astrological or astronomical reasons to read the story we just read as factual or historic in a narrow way. That is, no star could actually have guided the Magi southward from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, for instance. So some people have tried to build theories about how the stars, and actually now with Saturn and what's happening now in the sky, to people think, oh, that might be some correlation and things, but that seems to be really far off. And it's actually usually what the biblical texts are doing, that they're referencing other biblical texts and talking about the Christian revelation in ways that are interrelated, but sometimes not factual in the modern historical sense that we want to read in it. But what is interesting is actually looking at these parallels, because these parallels are going to tell us how we're supposed to read the text, because we're going to read the text with the text that are around them. So it's going to give us the contexts of this text. And that's what we're going to do, because there are a lot of different stories in the pagan literature of the time. Some of them look pretty much like the story of the Nativity, like a ruler having a son being born and the star leading to the sun, and all these type of stories. They are really present. You can find, if you want to look online, this type of pagans literature interested in the story of kingship and stars. But I'm going to look at what the Hebrew Bible has for us. And that's deeply related to this story of the Magi and the star. So one of these stories which are really related to this text can be found in the book of Numbers, chapter 22 to 24. You've probably heard about this story and read it. It's very famous. So it's the story of Balaam, who was a magus, so a single of Magi. He was a magus. He was also from the east, the text says, and he was summoned by a king, Balak. So he was summoned by a king, Balak, who was king of Moab. When the Israelites were entering the Holy Land, or the land where Moab was. So you see, you have this kind of evil king, like this villain king, just like in the story we just read with Herod. You have this Magi coming from the east into the land and delivering some teaching, or in the case of the story of Balaam and Balak, a blessing or a curse, because Balak summons Balaam to come to his kingdom to actually curse the Israelites, but he cannot do it because God prevents him. And so this is a very famous story, and so here you can see all the relationship between this story and the story from Matthew go beyond what we're going to talk about with the stars, because you can see there's a donkey in the story too, something refined in also apocryphal Gospels for the nativity scene. There's an angel, just like you see also in the Gospel, the story of the nativity. So the two stories have to be read against each other to actually understand what's the Magi doing there, and how can we understand it. And one of the prophecies that the Balaam gives after he has finally reached the land of Moab, when on his way he was actually impeded by the angel. He gave this prophecy: I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the people of Seth. Edom will be conquered. Seir, his enemy, will be conquered. But Israel will grow strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. So in this text, in the one we in the text of the 2 chapters of Balaam, you have also in the prophecies he gives the story of a king of the Jews who is going to be born from akin to a star. A star will come out of Jacob. The Magi in Matthew and Balaam have much in common. So they are both astrologists, they practice divination, and there is this malevolent power, as I mentioned, who is ruling against the working of God's redemption for his people. So in the case of Balaam, the king Malek wants to curse the people, and in the case of Matthew's gospel, you have the king Herod who is attending. He wants to basically kill baby Jesus and the innocents later. So there is this basically villain power that's trying to go against the redemption work of Christ. And in both cases, you see that the Magi appear as very positive figures. They're not depicted as villain or like magicians who are going to work against the work of God. They're actually the one following and telling us what's the work of God and how is the redemption going to play out. So they witness to it. They're not going against it. So I suggest that if you want to go more in depth of like seeing all the parallels between the nativity story and the story of Balaam, you read it for yourselves, because you'll see a lot of these parallels that are not strictly don't have strictly something to do with the story of the stars and the influence of them. So in a sense, what the Magi are doing is that they're investigating in a way that's quite technical, something that now we understand as being the revelation and how it's happening through them. So I'm going to move to the. So the Magi are basically being directed. Oh no, sorry. Being directed to the. So that was about the singing donkey. That's what I suggest you to have a look if you want to see how you see the story of the star, the donkey, and the Magi who are come together in the 2 narratives.
Go back to that one just for 1 second. You took that photo, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was really struck by it because the donkey is singing, and the story of Balaam and the ass. If you read it, you can pick up some of those details. And I love it that the angels are singing up there and the donkey is singing below. And as Joris pointed out, I didn't spot it at first, the star is right behind the donkey's head. Yeah, it's right behind the donkey's head, and interestingly, it's also inside the crib. And that's going to be meaningful for what we're going to see. Because there's the whole question of what's this star? Is it Jesus? Is it what's the relationship between the star and the revelation? Is it an angel? There are a lot of questions behind the star. Nothing is going to be resolved. I'm just kindling different questions. But so if you want, the Magi technological skills guide them to Christ. So there's the question of how much technology can you use to actually understand the revelation, and that's going to be a very important question. And for us, it could be also a very important question: how much technology do we need to understand the revelation? Do we need any? What's going to happen when we actually arrive there? Are we going to still hold on to our technological knowledge, or are we just going to give homage and
and give our crowns to Christ. So maybe there is in this Magi narrative a way to understand and practice astrology for both early Christians and for us, that's in a way directed towards the worship of God. And that's going to be the big question for early Christian authors, is how to reconcile the two and see that maybe astrology can guide us towards Christ instead of being an idol for itself. And all the narratives in the Bible where you find Magi are positive ones, where the Magi actually lead you to some form of guidance. And even the stories about magics, some of the stories about magics are not as negative as we think when we have a look at them by comparing the texts. Another very important source in early Christian understanding of astrology is not in the Bible, but it's almost contemporaneous to the Bible, to the canon of the New Testament and the later texts in the New Testament. It's a letter by Ignatius of Antioch, who was one of the early Christian teachers, to the Ephesians. And he tells something in this letter. I think we can read it together because it's really interesting. And we'll see that a lot of the threads we've discussed can be found there. How then was he, Christ, revealed to the eons, so to the different times, like cosmogonic times? A star shone in heaven, brighter than all the stars, and its light was ineffable, and its novelty caused astonishment. All the other stars, together with the sun and moon, became a chorus for the star, and it outshone them with its light. And there was perplexity as to whence came this novelty so unlike them. Thence what destroyed all magic, and every bond vanished. Evil's ignorance was abolished. The old kingdom perished, God being revealed as human, to bring newness of eternal life. And what had been prepared by God at its beginning. Hence, all things were disturbed, because the destruction of death was being worked out. So you see this question of like different eons, so different kingdoms, different powers were influencing you, and how these two different kingdoms are, the old one is being replaced by the new one. So if you remember the story of Balaam, the story of the Nativity, there are questions of kingdom. There is the King Herod who is being replaced by another king. And this comes through also for the pagans with the question of the kingdom, the power of the stars, which is being replaced in this text, in this tradition, by the power of another star, a new star that escapes the determinism of all the stars that came before, which is the star of Christ. So what you can see in the story of the Nativity and the role the star is playing is that it's kind of a way of a syncretic way of integrating the revelation of Christ into the worldview of the pagan, for whom, as some scholars said, astrology was one of the major pieties. So it was so much part of their worldview that to tell this revelation to people who hold to this worldview, you had to say, so it was a star, but it was a star that actually as the text overshone all the other stars. And that's why also this star is moving and is leading to a place, to a specific place. So it almost has a personality, contrary to so much of the stars we've seen, that even if they're deities, they're still fixed in the sky and you can still spot them. This one, you have to follow it. So it's creating quite a different story, and that's a star which is already more humane than any of the stars you could find in the sky. So if we remember what it meant to be under the influence of the stars for the ancient, it meant that you were enslaved, or you had to manage to deal with a big set of laws. And the coming of Christ also means that you have, something is happening in the revelation that you're no longer to be under the influence of the laws of the revelation so far. So that became set as the Hebrew Bible. And so there is, in this story of the star and the working out of the revelation with the image of the star, this idea that you are going to be set free from the power of laws, either the law of the star or the law of the tradition of Moses. And it's really interesting when you think of the question of influence, because influence, the first meaning of influence is influence of the stars. And then we used it metaphorically to talk about other forms of influence. But the first one is the influence of the stars. So who are you going to worship? Who are you going to follow? Was the question. And how are this intermediary going to play out against your following of God himself? So it's also the questions that you see at that time about whether the law was entrusted by angels or by God directly. And if you follow the star, are you following God? If you follow the law, are you following God? And so the moment of the nativity and the revelation is basically saying, you're fine, like you don't need to use intermediary anymore or trust in them to reveal you the thing. They're going to lead you to them, but it's not them that are actually guiding you. But they are still present. And that's something which is very different from our modern way of talking about astrology, because we think of astrology as either totally wicked, and so you have to forget it altogether. But that's not how they understood it, as we could see. So I'm going to conclude basically on these ideas. So today we have moved from the influence of the law, which was flowing to us from created man, to the direct divine human law revealed in Jesus Christ. If you want, the way Ignatius and many early Christians did to deny the role of the stars in the economy of salvation, just like they didn't deny the role of the laws, but they insisted on the fact that both the stars and the laws were now fully dependent on Jesus Christ. And for Ignatius of Antioch, basically, he's not saying that magic altogether has to be put in the bin. He's basically saying another magic is replacing the other one. And it's basically a counter, more powerful magic, which is the magic directly from God, instead of these intermediary powers that have had powers over you. So the star become really Christ-like in a very strange way. So Christ's redeeming work means that through him we are not submitted to any other created power. And to show us this, it has to be worked out in creation, that is through a new Christ-like star. And the image of the star, if used to depict the Christian victory on the star's fate, is really interesting, because for people who believed in the power and influence of stars, this text from Matthew and Ignatius are telling us the new and only real star is this presence of Jesus Christ. All the celestial beings are reoriented around him, and that's why you have this moving star too. So the star that the Magi see is therefore not an astrological sign in this very pagan way, and but it's not an ordinary star, and that's why it's moving too. Although it looks like one, and that's very important that it looks like a star, but it's not one, because it means that it's one step into the incarnation. So it's a cosmological step into the incarnation. So the God is first incarnated in the star, so in one of the first thing he created, which is the celestial beings. And the star, little by little, guides to the core, which is the nativity. And that's why also the animals are important as in between. And a lot of apocryphals try to reconstruct this creation narrative redux, if you want. So you have the star, which is already a form of God basically becomes the star and then becomes the donkey and becomes the God himself in Christ. So there is this reworking of creation that's so important in the telling of the nativity and the coming of Christ, which is a new creation. And it's a replacement of the ancient times, the ancient eons, the ancient kingdoms by a new kingdom. And that's why I also put these two pictures, because I think they're showing us that in different ways. On the right side, you can see a picture of Christ, who is in the middle and shines like a star. And around that, you have the different zodiac signs. So everything is reoriented and fulfilled in this centering around Christ. But it's not denying it. And that's really important, because a lot of post-Reformation Christianity has totally denied the meaning and power of astrology as a form of participation in the revelation. And on the other hand, you have this very interesting poster from Jesus Christ Superstar, when you see actually the actor who is playing Christ is the star in the modern sense, and you can see a star shining behind him. So there is this participation of light, and that's also something you find in the Gospel of the beginning of the Gospel of John, when a light came into the world. So there is no separation of light on one side that would be totally disembodied, and Christ on the other hand, who would be this little fleshy baby in the crib. So there's the form of participation, and that's how God created the world in the first place, and in the second, with the creation, with the nativity and the coming of Christ. Well, that's all I have. I hope I was not so confusing, because my notes were not as clear. It's written too small on the screen, so I couldn't read it. No, that's fine. So I tried to remember what I was saying. I think, do you have any, maybe you can go back. Do you have any questions, remarks? I think it's really interesting to read all these texts together, because it doesn't lie, like the truth about them don't lie on one text, and really understanding the whole cultural context and what it meant for them, which is so different from than what it means for us, what stars are, and they're way more, even for the pagans of the time, they were way more human and embodied than what we have done with them, which is pure physics and mechanics. And that's not how people lived with the stars.
That's something that struck me as I was reading it too, that a view of it has somehow been impoverished unless we are qualified astrophysics, when we can really wonder at it in a really technical way. But this whole universe that's imbued with purpose and light has been replaced for an ordinary layperson like me with this vast interstellar emptiness and these bodies obeying laws that are nothing, that are sort of technical laws. They're not laws about love or transcendence or transformation or recreation. They're laws that are fixed, and they're about physics.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, because I think all knowledge we gain today and everything you read about the stars and everything is going to be technical and scientific things. So there you see a new newspaper saying, like, there's a new star discovered and everything. So all the teachings that you hear about the universe is basically teaching coming from this scientific, materialistic, technical knowledge of the stars. But you don't hear so much about the spirituality of the stars.
It's a sort of evacuation of meaning.
Yeah.
That they're not there for a reason.
Yeah.
There's no reason that holds it together. The only reason is reason with a capital R, that enables you to know about their movements or where they might have come from. But I think this... I mean, one thing that I did notice, particularly about the medieval accounts of astrology and the birth of astronomy, was that it was also a little bit claustrophobic. There was no place to go and hide. That, you know, you were surrounded by these layers of onion skin of the spheres, and each layer was full of light. I was wondering what happens beyond the fixed stars. What happens beyond the prima mobile? But I remember thinking that was when I was a child, and it filled me with more fear than anything else.
I think we
suppose.
have it. What happens?
In that one there.
The one that's one of the. This one.
Yes, the cross is there. God is there.
And you have
the angels.
The house of God and all the elects. The elects.
The elect.
Select.
Chelum.
And the heaven and the empire.
The empire of heaven.
The empire have.
The Imperium.
The Imperium, house of God and all the elects. So that's what is happening beyond.
I suppose that's something to look forward to.
Yeah.
There was a theory about this star. The Babylonians, and this comes out in apocryphal literature too, where each nation of the earth has a guardian angel. And when nations go to war against each other, guardian angels are fighting each other in heaven. So that, and all of these angels are represented in the constellations or in the planets. So the star, they said, could have been, I mean, this is all complete theory, but it's based on how people observed these things in the past. The star could have been a particular comet moving through a particular constellation that was associated with that country. So each constellation had a country assigned to it. The art of interpreting comets was very complicated because it depended on the time of their appearance, the direction that they were going in, and their shape. Their shape was extremely important because if the comet was shaped like a sword, it meant that war was coming. If a comet had a raggedy appearance on the back of it, it could mean a plague was coming to that place or that country. However, not all comets were disastrous. They could sometimes be seen as messengers from one of the higher spheres. But again, it depended on their shape. Comets can appear to be moving in a direction that their tail is facing in from our point. So when we look at a comet, we think that they're moving in the direction of their head, but actually it depends on the solar wind, and they can sometimes move across the fixed stars in a direction that appears to us to be contrary to they're moving into their tail instead of into their head. And that was considered also to be a bad sign. But once again, that's all speculation, and based on those technical observations in the past, they were very careful to keep all of those things written down, and they've since been unearthed again, as we saw from the Babylonian examples there and the Egyptian ones too. That was really interesting. Thanks, Joyce. I'd forgotten the story about Balaam and the lamb.
Yeah, it's a fascinating text because it's kind of a vignette in the book of Numbers, and it's probably a very old text. It's probably one of the oldest texts also in the Bible. Some of the prophecies. Yeah, it's so it's basically someone who is not Jewish and not part of this culture that acknowledges the power of God of Israel and says they cannot. So it's the question of all the intercultural relations that come into play also with astrology, because it's traditionally like different worldviews that come into play. It's just like you have different planets that interact with each other.
Are there any questions or observations or
Nigel,
Yes.
I'm on the phone. I came in just a few minutes late. I don't know whether you mentioned the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction.
Yes, right at the very beginning, we mentioned that. Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and you mentioned that may have been the star that the Magi saw?
Yes, that was the theory of it. Yeah, that somebody has put forward. That it's possible to plot the position of the stars at any point in history now because of mathematical formulae.
Right.
And I believe once again this conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, this idea that Jupiter is the bringer of jollity, of joy, and Saturn is the planet of woe. The conjunction of these two planets describing the life of Jesus, and the dominant one being Jupiter, that is brightest, and conjoining with this is a message of joy out of a place of sorrow. I think that's the way the tale goes. I'm not sure which constellation it's going to be in, though. I hadn't read that part of it. And I'm not even 100% sure if plotting the movement of the planets through history lands you up with the same conjunction in 1 AD or 0.
And I think it's asking questions which are very secular questions. It's asking questions to the revelation that the revelation doesn't shape you into thinking this way. If you actually read the Bible, if you actually read the text, it's more asking of you to, like, how can I say it? Like, you see, like I think you can learn more of relating the story of the nativity and the star in the nativity to other moments in the Bible when you hear about celestial beings, like the creation or Balaam, than when you actually look at something which is a total different form of discourse, which is modern scientific discourse, which is going to talk about physics, about like the surface, instead of spiritual realities. You know, I think these stars are telling us something about spiritual realities. And yes, you can try to assume and try to look at the stars, but it's never going to be the one answer. So maybe you can find some form of correlation at that time. But what is interesting about what the texts in the Bible are doing is that they're never leaving you with one answer. They never. You cannot. That's a very historical, critical move to say, "Oh, I'm going to spot where Jesus was born, which star was there in the sky." But that's not telling you anything about the Christian revelation. It's not telling you anything about the joy, about the mercy of God. It's not telling you anything.
Historical resonance.
It's so dry.
I think it sometimes reminds me of those things like when people say, well, the Hebrews were commanded not to eat pork because it goes off quickly in the desert. And you think, no, wait a minute, there must be a different reason for this.
But
because, I mean, everything goes off quickly.
But that's a very interesting question, though, because for us, who are so scientific, maybe it's our way of hearing the revelation. Just like for the people in the ancient times, they needed to have it related through astrology. Maybe we need to hear it from scientists who tell us, oh, that existed, because this correlation of stars actually existed through this scientific, modern,
vehicle.
Yeah. So maybe
that's good. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure God can use anything.
Yeah.
If He can use us.
Yeah.
Well, I have a little prayer for us to finish up. It's 8:30 and the snow is falling and the wind is blowing. Let us pray. Ô Dieu, tu as révélé ton Fils unique aux nations de la terre, grâce à l'étoile qui les guidait. Puisque nous te connaissons déjà par la foi, conduis-nous jusqu'à la contemplation de ta splendeur, par Jésus-Christ, notre Seigneur. Veille, Seigneur, avec ceux qui travaillent, veille ou pleurent cette nuit, et donne mission à tes anges de garder ceux qui dorment. Prends soin des malades, Seigneur Christ, donne le repos à ceux qui sont fatigués, bénis les mourants, soulage ceux qui souffrent, console les affligés, et préserve le bonheur de ceux qui sont dans la joie. Nous te le demandons par ton amour. Amen.
Amen.
Bénissons le Seigneur.
Nous rendons
Nous rendons
grâce
grâce à Dieu. Good. Well, if you have any comments, any questions, or you'd like further information on something, just leave a comment down below and we'll monitor it and reply in the comments. Thanks.